The Psychology of Murder by Casey Lytle. Special episode, Bryan Kohberger, the suspect in the University of Idaho murders. So why am I calling this a special episode instead of a numbered episode? Because this is an open, ongoing case. I'm recording this in January 2023. His preliminary hearing isn't until June, and who knows when the trial will be. There will be a lot of new information coming out then that could change everything I'm about to say here. So, if so, I would either do a correction to this or remove it, but we're going basically on what we know right now. And what we're looking at here in this episode is looking at his potential progression toward what he did. Toward carrying out the act. If what we know about him turns out to be true, what people who knew him are saying about him, he does seem to show a progression that parallels a couple other serial killers. So we'll get to that as we go through here. One of the things that seems to be very consistent that different people have said about him is that for a lot of his school life anyway, at least the first few years of high school, he was a bit overweight and was bullied a lot, probably because of that. But around senior year, he lost a lot of weight, his attitude changed, and by many reports, instead of being bullied, he became the bully. If we parallel this to abuse victims, we can see a similar, although not homicidal, trend here, where people who have been in abusive environments for a length of time, once they get out of them, they can go in one of two directions. They can come out being very passive, always kind of seeking out a protector, which actually puts them at kind of high risk of falling in with another abuser. The other route is they can come out saying, I am never going to let anyone do that to me again. That will never happen to me again. And they can become very hypersensitive to the perception of threat or of being controlled. And that population is a high risk of actually becoming the very thing that they had been victim of before. Now you may say, how can someone end up doing the things that were done to them? It's because there's a much different perception when you're on the receiving end of something like that than there is when you were on the delivery end of it. On the delivery end of it, you can feel very justified. It can feel very self-protective. But also, on the end of that spectrum, you can have a different reaction. You can have the creation of greater hostility, greater aggression, such as Kohberger becoming a bully, and you can have the emergence of revenge fantasies. Usually, revenge fantasies are very common and normal. If someone has hurt you severely in some way, it is not uncommon to have sometimes very aggressive, maybe even homicidal revenge fantasies toward them. That's actually considered not just normal or expected, but sometimes is considered healthy, because fantasy, whatever it is, can be a healthy way to vent an emotion or a drive without actually impacting your real-world environment. Now, in most people, we would see that decrease over time. Those will fade away. But those can also become very obsessive and motivating. And what do I mean by motivating? I mean, as they become more frequent, more obsessive, they'll also become more detailed. It can start to create the urge to carry it out. That'll cause you to start thinking about doing it, how you would do it. At that point, it might burn out, or it might lead to actually thinking about seeking out potential victims and carrying out the act. At that point, all you need is some final trigger to set that off, or perhaps just an opportunity that presents itself to do that. Now, why would we think Kohberger seems to be possibly in that category? The seeds for what he did later does seem to be in that senior year, where he suddenly lost a lot of weight, and then his behavior changed from, like we said, being bullied to being the bully. He likely got kind of a rush from that. And that possibly escalated into revenge fantasies that possibly further escalated into ideas of murder. Now, is there a serial killer we draw a parallel to on here? Absolutely, even almost at the same age. Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, who is a serial killer technically by the number of his victims. He was really a mob hitman who continued once he became an independent person within organized crime. But he had also been bullied. Now, in addition, he had a very abusive upbringing by both of his parents. We don't have evidence at the moment that Kohberger was in any kind of abusive environment. That could change, but at the moment we don't have that. What we do have is the bullying behavior. Now, Kuklinski's change was extremely rapid, and by his account. He was actually being bullied and beat up by some people in the neighborhood, and he just had this switch flip that he wasn't going to take that anymore. He went into his house, again, this is by his account later, pulled a wooden clothes rod out of a closet and just went outside, and by his description, he went to war. He also talked about getting a rush from that and feeling powerful from that. And that could be something else that, in Kohberger's case, could have occurred and basically fueled satisfaction in being a bully. Now, how could someone like this end up taking the lives of people, right? Kind of dismissing them. This all comes down to what groups or individuals we give actual value to their lives. It's probably no surprise that across the human spectrum, there are people based on your either geographic or social proximity that you've put greater value on them and are more concerned when bad things happen to them than you are with others. If we look at it in the realm of a video game, if you go into an online video game with other people, there are some of the characters in there who are real people in real life, and you give more value to those players. But there are also a lot who are non-playable characters, NPCs, just part of the game, right? So one of the things possibly restricting Kohberger while he was in Pennsylvania was the people around him that were familiar with him and an environment that was familiar with him, which means it had great value. But when he moved to Pullman, all of a sudden, the entire environment was new. There was nothing there that had any previous connection to him. And essentially, all the people were NPCs. He didn't know any of them. He had no social history or connection to any of them, which would mean they wouldn't have the same value as other people would back in Pennsylvania. At this point, if this is progressing, and if you look at the research questions that he put out the spring and summer before relocating to Pullman, in which he was asking questions looking for thoughts and feelings involved when committing a criminal act. He seemed to be looking specifically for murder. This was curiosity in that part. He was already having fantasies about it. Those fantasies created a certain rush or a certain feeling. But again, fantasy is not reality because you control everything in it. And you can stop fantasizing about it at any moment, and there's no repercussion in your real world. As opposed to if you actually carry out the act, you don't control everything. And once you're done, there is no going back on it. It's going to exist. So let's go back to high school for a moment. One of the issues right around the time he lost a lot of weight and became more aggressive, it is suspected that he had possibly an addiction to heroin during that time. Now, this is something that may or may not be confirmed later on. A couple have mentioned it, and he possibly went into rehab after high school. So by all accounts, at the moment, from what we know, he stayed off of it, and as people say, started to put his life together. But is there a possibility that the drug rush had attached itself to his homicidal fantasies, and now those fantasies imagined a similar kind of rush, and that's one of the reasons he was looking for that. Another reason in serial killer research. This is when we bring another serial killer into it. Tommy Lynn Sells, the transient serial killer in the Midwest, whose movement actually made it difficult to track him down and finally capture him. He had a drug issue frequently along the way, but he reported that committing a murder produced the same rush in him that the drugs had. So basically, murder became a substitute for drugs. Given the research that Kohberger had done in his area of study, he had to have come across those accounts and interviews with Tommy Lynn Sells where he equated the rush of murder with the rush of a drug, especially an opioid drug. So was that something that he was looking for, another rush like that? Did he think killing would produce that same kind of rush? That's a possibility. Now, if we're going along here that this was a progression, when people ask what would his motive have been, if he was progressing toward this, his motive was simply to commit a murder, and these victims just happened to be the targets he chose. If you look at the probable cause affidavit, according to the cell phone data, it looks like he was stalking this house very early on. The murders were in November. He was first stalking the house in late August. In fact, the first time that they recorded was a day before his fall semester started at Washington State. In that case, how could one of them got on his radar so quickly? It's most likely he encountered them in a public place in some way, which again seems to point at the two who worked at the Mad Greek restaurant, Maddie and Zaina, as the two who are most likely to get on his radar. Now, there's something a little more disturbing here if that's the progression, if it was just the act of committing a murder that was the motivation and the drive. And what that is he very likely had at least considered alternatives as targets. So when police really track down that phone data and look at where he was and how many places he was around, they are very likely to find at least one other residence that he seemed to stalk at least for a while before choosing the Idaho students as his targets. And that other target is likely in Pullman, closer to where he lived, where he would have been encountering more people more directly. Why would he have chosen Idaho? Probably because he thought it would divert police attention, that it was too risky to commit a murder close to where he was going to school and living, and thought that maybe doing one across the state line in Idaho would draw more police attention to University of Idaho and not so much to Washington State. So now if we go to, again, the entire subject area of this series, Psychology of Murder, in which in that series I look at progression and key points at which certain progressions were allowed to run uninterrupted, and if you had interrupted them, you may have changed the outcome. Does he show key points? Probably pretty obvious at this point, his senior year in high school, when he had both the drug issue and where his behavior changed from bullied to bully. That if you had been able to guide that transition and basically tone down the aggression that came with it, find kind of a more functional way of dealing with that, you may have been able to interrupt that progression really early on, find some more functional way to route that frustration. We have to look at really what let the aggression go, who had the ability to see this change and could have done anything about it. The other one we have to think about with the rumored addiction to heroin, what was his introduction to that drug? Was it through a peer group? And did he seek it out for some reason? And why would he decide to seek it out? What was that route that led to that? But in both of those, the drug use, the desire for that rush, the increase in aggression, there were some base traits that were being not addressed in his immediate environment. And I hate to always sound like I'm pointing at parents here, but parents are the front line to be able to observe changes and observe stressors like that, and have an opportunity to address it. What may have been fueling that part of it that led him to those choices that were uninterrupted? So now the other option I'll throw in here, if it isn't this progression, if the desire isn't just murder itself, what is the other possible motive? That would take us to the incel side of the fence, the involuntary celibates, who are romantically, sexually unsuccessful with women, which a lot of people are, but what makes an incel unique is that they take the inability to connect, which is usually due to poor social reading, social understanding, poor social skills, and they blame it on the target of their obsession and become angry at them. They not only tend to generalize this out into anger at women, but they also tend to be angry at men who are romantically and sexually successful. And that's where that rage goes. The other possibility on motive here is he developed kind of a infatuation and obsession with someone in that house. And again, at the point at which the stalking started, it still likely would have been one of the two who worked in that restaurant, because that's where he would have encountered them. Now, again, people will point out the Mad Greek restaurant served meat, and Kohberger is supposedly very strong vegetarian. There aren't really pure vegetarian options in Moscow or Pullman, but the Mad Greek frequently shows up in top 5 lists for vegetarians who are looking for restaurants that do have vegan or vegetarian options on the menu, and that's why he may have gone there. People will point out the rumor so far, I haven't heard actual confirmation of this, that when he went vegan, he made his parents get rid of all their pots and pans, anything that had ever cooked meat in it. And he wanted, brand new pots and pans. If that's true, it's probably more a reflection of the power and influence he had over his parents, and probably kind of a spoiled history, than it is of a really strict guideline into what he would eat or not. Because once he was arrested, although they did cater to his vegetarian diet, I really doubt they got rid of all their pots and pans and cooking it. And he didn't go on any hunger strike or anything in protest of that. So again, the pots and pans are more the influence he had over his parents, which if he did have that kind of control, that also would be an indicator as to why they either didn't want to or couldn't step in and intervene during that senior year. So again, any of this could be totally out the window in the next 6 months when more evidence comes out, when we learn more about him. Again, this is just what we know right now, what we can say right now based on what we know right now. Because there's gag orders on authorities and lawyers, anything we're going to hear between now and June is just going to come from people who knew him and fill that out. So there's still a lot to learn in this case, a lot to know. Any of these things could change over time with new information coming out.